North Sentinel Island is one of the Andaman Islands found in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's come to prominence recently because of the death at the hands of a Stone Age tribe who have refused all contact with the outside world of an American missionary called John Allen Chau, who was killed there in November 2018. Now, it's amazing that this island exists just 50 kilometers away from a fully developed modern city at Port Blair, yet the natives of this island, known as the Sentinelese, have no idea it's there and have hardly any grasp of what the modern world around them is at all, having lived on this island for tens of thousands of years. Now, in this video I want to look at how is this possible in the 21st century that we have a tribe of people who are so far behind, essentially living in the Stone Age, as well as making some interesting references along the way. So it's thought that 60,000 years ago, around about that time, people from Africa migrated out into various parts of the world, and that those who came to be known as the Sentinelese were one of the first groups to do this, having migrated from Little Andaman Island to the south. Now, an interesting point about this is because obviously we have hardly any idea about the people on this island, as hardly anyone's ever landed on the island and much fewer have survived to tell the tale. So one way we think we can work this out is that, interestingly enough, the turtles around North Sentinel Island are afraid of the Sentinelese. And turtles take a long time, tens of thousands of years, to adapt and to learn to become afraid of humans. It's something that gets passed down. So it's thought that because they are afraid of the Sentinelese, that they must have been there for a considerable amount of time. Now, another way that they think that these people have been there for so long is that when the British in the 19th century came to the island, they brought various natives of the Jarawa and Unga tribes with them, as the Indian government would do in the 1980s. And when they tried to make them communicate with the Sentinelese, they found that their languages, although they were probably a related people because they are very similar, they live in a similar region, and their painting styles are so similar, they actually weren't able to communicate with each other. The languages weren't mutually intelligible anymore. Now, if we look at Europe, for instance, where you have languages like Italian, French, and Spanish, all coming from Vulgar Latin some 2,000 years ago, these are pretty much are mutually intelligible, and that was 2,000 years ago. So if these languages no longer are mutually intelligible, it suggests that they were much further removed back in time. Much more time has gone past for these languages to develop differently, to the point where they can no longer communicate with someone. They are different languages at that stage. Now, an interesting reference, the first one, is by 13th century explorer Marco Polo, who references the natives of the Isles, saying they are very cruel and kill and eat every foreigner whom they can lay their hands upon. Although this seems to be contradicted by some more modern evidence, because we're not sure if he's simply making these dark-skinned foreigners seem to be barbarous and scary to his readers in Europe. But it was found that in 2006, 2 fishermen went too close to the island and they were killed by the natives there, although they were buried, and the Indian police in a helicopter tried to get back to these bodies and found that they had been unmolested, so to speak. So that calls into question whether they actually are cannibalistic, because they obviously hadn't consumed the bodies of these people that they'd killed. So this is another interesting case of conflicting sources of evidence, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and which will be useful later on, because I'm soon going to be making videos about the North in America. So this is a very interesting anthropological study, because we essentially have a Stone Age people, as the Native Americans were, and a much more modern people interacting in live time. So we can sort of make some assumptions and draw some conclusions and look if this would be a similar situation to various contacts with native peoples in the Americas for the Viking Age. So another interesting one is that in 1771 the first modern reference to the island was by a British ship which surveyed, and the captain of the ship said that he could see many lights on the island. So that indicates that there were obviously fires, which indicates that there were people there. However, this has sort of been questioned in modern times. Various articles published suggest that they don't actually have the ability to make fire, whereas that would call that into question, that earlier source, if it is to believe. So then we have 2 contradicting points of view. Now, a possible reason for some of the antagonism between the outside world, obviously, and the North Sentinelese, they basically attack anyone who comes onto the island, apart from on one occasion, is that when a British expedition in 1880 led by Maurice Vidal Portman came to the island, they brought native Jarawa tribesmen with them, and it's possible that actually the Jarawa were old enemies of the Sentinelese. The Jarawa in their language and the Onge both have names for North Sentinel Island, which suggests exists. Obviously they know that it was there and that they had contact with the people, as they had canoes that were able to sail that far. But this obviously didn't work in the favour of the British if they were enemies, because then the North Sentinelese would imagine that they were in league with them, and so see those other people coming to the island from afar as enemies. Now this is interesting because similar cases happen in North America, so a lot of the time these people coming from outside didn't grasp the full complexity of native tribes and their enmity towards each other. So for example, the Norsemen in Greenland with the different groups of native Inuit there, so the Dorset culture originally being subsumed by the Thule culture and the difference between them. Also, hypothetically, in North America, where they landed on mainland North America, between the different tribes there, and also of course much later on with the second European colonization of the Americas, there was a lot of oversimplification of these regions, as well as throughout the world with colonizing forces. As well, what probably didn't help is that Maurice Vidal Portman found 6 of the natives. They actually fled further inland into the jungles, but he found 6, 2 elderly people and 4 children, and brought them back to Port Blair, whereupon the 2 elderly people became very sick and died, and then he quickly returned the 4 children, which really didn't leave a good impression in the minds of the natives, and can you blame them? Interestingly as well is that in 1867 a merchant ship, the Nineveh, was actually shipwrecked off the coast of North Sentinel Island, and the crew had to fight back with sort of stones and with furniture and things like that as the natives tried to attack them, but they were then rescued by a British naval patrol. Now as well, what's interesting is that this also happened in 1977 and in 1981 with the MV Russley and the MV Primrose, both cargo ships, iron ships, that you can still see the shipwrecks of on North Sentinel Island, because there are a lot of reefs around North Sentinel Island, making it very treacherous waters for these boats to go in. Now what's interesting here is, as a Stone Age peoples, they used stone and wood for their tools and weapons, but that after the 1970s, when these shipwrecks had occurred and when the Indians sent missions, the Indians being the Indian government, sent missions to the island, they were fired upon with the usual aggression from the Sentinelese, but that arrows that they retrieved that were shot at them, they found had iron tips to them. So it's possible that these shipwrecks have actually potentially set off the Iron Age on the island, because now there is a source of iron for them to scavenge, and we now have evidence that they used it, which is a very interesting prospect, just as with the Native Americans and the introduction of the horse, completely by accident, but it revolutionized their world entirely. Now, as North Sentinel Island went from being a British possession to an Indian possession, the Indian government decided that they needed to communicate with the native peoples and to bring them into the fold, essentially. So from 1967 onwards, they started sending in these expeditions with anthropologists and researchers and scientists, etc., to try and make friendly contact with the Sentinelese people. Interestingly enough, in 1975, the ex-king of Belgium, King Leopold III, also attempted, but he was chased down by a single warrior with a bow and arrow, and his expedition was forced to retreat again under a hail of arrows. This wasn't a Belgian invasion, by the way. This was just him wanting to see this island that is still living in the Stone Age. Now, interestingly enough, there was actually one successful friendly mission, which was in 1991, where they brought along members of the Onga tribe who were shouting the word for coconut in their language, and they were throwing coconuts onto the shore, and there's a video, I'll link it in the description below, where you can see the Sentinelese picking up the coconuts, and then one of the warriors makes quite a clear gesture that he thinks that they've got enough coconuts and he wants the others to bugger off. But that was the one friendly encounter. Then afterwards, in 2004, there was of course the huge Boxing Day tsunami that ravaged the Indian Ocean region and killed hundreds of thousands of people. And obviously this was hugely devastating in the Andaman Islands as well. And it was feared that perhaps the Sentinelese and North Sentinel Island had been wiped out. So several days after the tsunami, they sent in a helicopter to check up on them, but once again there was a warrior that shot arrows at the helicopter. You can imagine the balls on these guys just shooting arrows at helicopters. Reminds me a bit of a scene from Avatar, which is amazing that this occurs in the 21st century. But they were still alive and kicking, and interestingly enough, it seems that these Stone Age peoples, also other related Andamanese tribes, possibly dealt better with these tsunamis than the modern Indian population on the Andaman Islands did. Now in 2006, as I already mentioned, there were two fishers, possibly who were drunk. They were actually fishing for crabs on the local shores. They let their boats go in too far, and they were also killed by the Sentinelese tribesmen there when they got too far. So clearly the Sentinelese don't want any contact with the outside world, which might not have been too bad of an idea. And of course, more recently, literally within the last week, has been the death of this guy, John Allen Chau, an American who wanted to bring the gospel, the word of Jesus, to these islanders, but was, just as the others who've tried to come to the island, was killed by the Sentinelese. Now, of course, he's not the only missionary. That's quite a historical thing, and it was a really weird headline that struck me and why I decided to make this video. Obviously, there's many examples throughout history, especially the periods I talk about, of missionaries being killed by people who don't want to accept the word of the Lord. So, for example, of course, I'm going to bring up St. Boniface, or Bonifatius, who was killed by the Frisians, martyred in Dokkum in Friesland today. You can still see where that occurred. There is a big, fat, laughing Boniface when you enter Dokkum in Friesland. So that's one example there. Now I want to look at the question, why can't you visit North Sentinel Island? Now, of course, it's a dangerous place, as these examples would say. People have died, and increasingly so, actually, people trying to get onto the island, with this last example of the American missionary, people being killed there. So it's for the safety of the outside world to not come onto the island. These are essentially primitive peoples, as much as we can learn from them, and as much as there's perhaps nothing wrong with that. They are primitive peoples, and they are dangerous. Now as well, it might be a case that it's actually better for them that we don't come onto this island. Now if we look, in this case the Americas again, it hasn't exactly gone down too well for the native peoples, and still today they are plagued by things like alcohol addiction and cigarettes and drugs, things like that, tobacco, which have decimated these populations. And it's true that in another example, the Jaroa, who I've already mentioned, they chose to integrate into the modern world, and they are really suffering as a consequence. In 1997, a few years after they'd sort of been, they'd made clear that they wanted to be added into the modern world and to receive help and things from the Indian government, they aren't doing too well right now, and they're suffering from problems like people going through stagecoaches on some kind of human safari of these tribal peoples, and it's really not been great. So perhaps the North Sentinelese have made a wise decision to stay away from the rest of the world and to ward off the rest of the world in such a violent way. Now as well, and interestingly enough, disease is a huge factor in why the Indian government stopped doing their visits in 1997 to stop this from happening. And this is because if we look at the New World, for instance, I think it's Jared Diamond who says that 90%, perhaps 90% up to that, of the native population in the New World was killed by various European diseases, which is a phenomenal figure. This is millions, hundreds of millions of people being wiped out by diseases. So if we look, for instance, at why this is, it also applies to the North Sentinelese, and why perhaps John Allen Chau has actually endangered the lives of all of these people, and that they may soon actually be wiped out because of germs, not even because of his preaching. So if we look at why the Europeans and Asians, and to a lesser extent some African peoples, they domesticated livestock very early on, and they lived in very close proximity with this livestock. So they often lived in the house, in the barn, with the livestock. And because of this, and because the livestock were living together, they produced a lot of germs, and they got ill, and these virus strains lived on the animals and fleas and things like that. So these then, because they were living so close to humans, these virus strains also developed so that they could cross-contaminate humans, as they're always looking for more hosts to live upon. So humans started to get sick, and then humans started to die. But of course, not all humans died, and some humans built up these protection against this, immunity to these diseases, and this would then spread among the population. Now then, in turn, it's kind of a seesaw. The virus strain would then mutate and grow stronger. More people would die, but then the humans would grow stronger immunity to these viruses, and then it would go in a cycle like that. But when they came to North America, imagine that these people have an immunity at level 50. That also means that the viruses, which have been developing to get over the immunity to take over a host, and then obviously the immunity's got stronger, then they're also at level 50. But when they came to the Americas, the people there had only really, some of them, domesticated the llama, and they didn't even live at home with the llamas. So they had no immunity to these diseases at all. So suddenly you have a level 50 disease going to a level 0 population, and that's why you get such a huge amount of Native Americans being wiped out by these diseases. Now imagine what would happen if this came to North Sentinel Island, this tiny island that has had barely any contact with the rest of the world, and we've moved way past that with our antibodies from even what it was in the 16th century with the Native Americans. It's an incredibly dangerous situation. And also, as a final point, why probably it's illegal to visit the island and why I think it should remain that way is that from a kind of culturally libertarian point of view, if the North Sentinelese people want to continue living in isolation in the way that they've been living for tens of thousands of years, then surely they should have the right to do that. They should have the right to live as they have done and to continue to do so despite the modern world. And it's not really our place to intrude on them. So I hope you found this video interesting. It's a bit different. I saw it in the news and I thought this is such a wacky headline that I have to really make a video about this. Some interesting points and overviews. Soon I'll be making some more videos in my series of the Norse colonization to the west across the Atlantic Ocean in Iceland, Greenland and North America. And as you've seen, I've drawn some comparisons there. So I hope you enjoy this video. Much more to come soon. Many more things for Christmas and of course the face reveal. So I hope you've enjoyed and I'll see you all very soon.